in large part how we approach it today, and one of the big things that we want to change on the digital side, or at least figure out a way that it can be done cost effectively. And I think things like we were talking about earlier, right? The voter engagement piece of it is like a good example of how you can still keep some version of the lights on so that it's not a complete, build up, tear down every time.
Welcome to the Ronin Project Podcast, a show about Asian Americans in politics rocking the boat, breaking the rules, and taking on the big fights. I'm your host, Bill Wong. Buckle up, it's time for Ronin's To Roll program. Hello, Ronin Nation. I'm excited to have a very special guest on the show this week. Gina Pak is the CEO for Tech for Campaigns. She joined Tech for Campaigns in 2022, leading its voter turnout initiative. She advises early-stage, mission-driven startups on strategic growth, and prior to TFC, she was a founding member of Blueland, where she was CMO. Gina received her MBA from Harvard Business School and undergraduate degrees in economics and political science from Stanford University. Welcome to the show, Gina.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you. Let's just jump right in. Let's start with your journey in politics. How did you get started and how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah, had a really long, winding road to get here, I will say. I've always really been interested in politics. I studied it in college. I've always sort of been fascinated, I think, by how much government and public servants interact with us in the course of our day-to-day lives. But, sort of in the model minority myth, so to speak, I went the traditional route of doing other things in the private sector first. So I've been in consulting, I've been in finance. And then I think after grad school, actually chose to go a bit more a-traditional, I guess, and get involved in early stage or the startup scene and got the entrepreneurship bug. I think with that, I became a lot more comfortable with deciding to follow my passions and my interests. And so that included things like sustainability and climate change, which was actually one of the reasons why I got involved with Blueland. And then after that experience, I think that combined with the pandemic and all of the AAPI hate and BLM and all the things that were just sort of happening, it felt like this would be the right time for me to take my experiences and bring them to a new space like politics. I'd also worked as a poll worker in LA County over the course of 2020 and just really saw what democracy at work was like. And, I think after that experience became so clear that there's not only a major talent gap, there's also a major digital gap in how we run our democracy today, and even in places advanced like California, right? And so I think based on that, it became a pretty easy thing for me to say, where can I put my energy? Where can I put my efforts? And TFC was a great fit, and it just sort of ended up working out. And so that's sort of how I gotten way more embedded in the space than I ever would have imagined.
Amazing. There's actually a funny story I had with LA County. They were rolling out their all vote by mail stuff and then electronic voting. And they had sent, I was a political director of the Assembly Democrats at the time. We sent some staffers down there to listen to their presentation. They had gone through their whole thing and said, okay, this is how it's going to be secure. This is going to be how people are going to verify that they voted. And they came back and everything's taken care of. And I said, well, did they explain what would happen if there was a power outage? And then they didn't have an answer. And I think that that's one of the challenges we have and when I look at campaigns, I look at it from an operational standpoint. I look at it from like worst case scenario, like what would happen instead of what they just tell you is how it's supposed to work. And I think that that's not a lot of people think from a tech standpoint when they're in this part of the game. And do you think that there are like blind spots like that occur now?
I think it's across the board. I think it as anything digital, whether that's technology and IT, whether that's marketing and messaging, whether that's just how to reach people on the platforms that they're most used to, right? I think field organizing and those methods are still incredibly important and effective. But I think just as a group, we have really fallen behind in terms of some of the major investments we need to make within digital infrastructure in particular, because, as fast moving as digital is, you can't just turn the lights on day one and assume that it's all going to be perfectly running day two, right? And so I think that's part of a huge part of what we do and why we exist as an organization. And so, I think the things we'll be working on this year going into next year's presidential will be pretty formative for that reason.
Well, can you tell us more about Tech for Campaigns, its mission, and its objectives?
Yeah, sure. So Tech for Campaigns, or TFC for short, the organization was born out of, I think the post 2016 era, like a lot of organizations, and needing to figure out where to put and funnel a lot of energy, right? There was a lot of energy, there was a lot of fervor, and wanting to do some good with that beyond just rage tweeting all the time and just being upset and like yelling at your computer screen or your TV, right? And so the organization since then has really evolved where we're really fighting for democratic values. And we're doing that using advanced digital marketing and data techniques, which is really core to who we are. And the whole intent is to be powered by lasting technology and data digital infrastructure that can really propel Democrats to win at scale. And so what does that mean? What does that look like? We really started by looking at two core trends. I think one is all the activity that we talk about and impacts our day-to-day lives is actually happening at the state or municipal level. It's happening much more like close to home as opposed to at the federal level, which is what's in the news and in the headlines of the New York Times every day, right? And so when we think about abortion access, when we think about voting rights, when we think about climate change, when we think about all the things that we care about, all those activities are actually being determined at the state level. And so, if we then layer on the fact that it's like our three founding members who came from Silicon Valley and they were looking at where the gaps were, and they said, there's digital. What else can we do in digital, right? And coming out of 2016, we were all sort of thinking that. And it sort of became clear that actually the impact that you can have with state legislative campaigns by bringing digital marketing and data into those worlds was immense, right? It's just significantly higher value than, let's say, at a federal level where that's only one part of the mix, right? They're looking at things like TV spending as well. And at a state level, it just doesn't really make sense to do that. And so just the ROI you can have of not only creating and making real impact and outcomes to flip or defend these seats and chambers using digital marketing became a pretty clear and obvious way for us to do what we do. And so the organization really started there. The way that we work is we work with state candidates to be their digital marketing arm. And so we will build and run their email or digital ads programs. We'll build and run their websites, their texting campaigns. And the beauty of it is actually run all by a volunteer network, by a set of skilled volunteers that are all doing this in their day jobs, right? So people are coming from the tech industry or top tier digital companies to bring their skills and volunteer them to the candidate. So the candidate actually gets these amazing services for free. Since we've started, we've served now over 600 campaigns on over 1,000 digital projects, which has been absolutely, I think, amazing to witness. And in 22, we helped flip chambers in Minnesota and Michigan and part of Pennsylvania, just given the amount of time that we spent there doing that work. And then, I think after we saw some successes in the early days in 2020, we're taking a hard look at where else we could take our philosophies around data, around digital, around experimentation, and thought, why don't we apply it to voter turnout? There's a specific path within voter turnout where the data is very visible, particularly vote by mail. And oh, wait, it was also the pandemic. And so that's how everyone's going to be voting. You're going to get a lot of data points, right? And so out of that sort of idea or that thesis, we actually built a voter turnout program that's fully digital, all about getting and signing up net new Democrats, or what that means, likely younger or non-white voters, to turn out and vote, and getting them to vote by mail or vote early. And I think for us to be able to do that program end to end was really something that felt unique to us at the time. And so now to date, we've signed up over 500,000 voters in that program, focusing only on purple states and places where we can make impact in terms of, again, executive level state offices like Attorney General, Governor, Secretary of State, et cetera, as well as helping our partners in terms of on the candidate side and further down ballot as well. So I think all of that's underpinned, I think, really when we think about our long-term infrastructure too, by what we call our learning engine. And so that's really taking all the data from, the 6-7 years of our work across the voter turnout side, across the candidate and campaign side, and saying, how can we surface and make this data much easier for people to engage with and interact with so that they can get all the best practices they need and not make it feel so arm's length or difficult to understand or frankly old, right? By the time we get our voter file or by the time we get our data, it's 6 months has passed and you're like, we've moved on. So how can we get some of that stuff surfaced faster, earlier, and more easily? And so that's going to be a huge part of what we're focused on this year.
Do you mainly interact with the consultants or the campaign, like the candidates?
The candidates and their teams, right? So we're working with campaign directors, digital directors, and then the candidates themselves. We're also working with the caucuses as part of that work as well.
That's great. I did a lot of work with DLCC. I mean, obviously, California is not a target for DLCC because we have so many Democrats. But it was always fun working with them. We helped them fundraise for their candidates and their PAC efforts
Yeah.
out of California because we know how critical their work is, and particularly we saw how important winning state houses were in this last election cycle with regard to the abortion issue,
Yeah.
and now LGBTQ rights that are going forward as well as race relations. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I really think that the battleground is in states. But here's an interesting question that I didn't
Yeah.
send to you previously, but
No
I'm
worries.
very interested in. One of the things we did in 2018, which was very rare, and this was in California, we had a couple of seats that we had to win back. And in one case, we actually approved digital 50 weeks out, which is huge. Usually, before
Mhm.
that, it was like 8 weeks out, maybe
Yeah.
six, something like that.
Yeah.
And then for our other races, we actually started digital 16 weeks out. So it was applying a technique that we thought like it was like slow drip, but being consistent in order
Yeah.
to lay the foundation. And one of the things that has really concerned me about Democratic Party politics is like, okay, well, we win these races, but
Yeah.
then we spend the next 18 months getting punched in the mouth with no response from at all, with no sensible types of message control or counter messaging
Sure.
that's out there. So we basically, take on water for 18 months and then hope that we bail ourselves out in time for election day. What are your thoughts with regard to efforts to apply digital and data and technology for not the campaign side of it, but from the issue and from the
Mm.
day-to-day voter engagement, like voter
Yeah.
retention? Because what
Yeah.
I'm really concerned about is as these things come, for example, last cycle, we lost Chinese Democrats in New York. We're losing some Latinos, not all. I mean, it's not a flood, but it's enough to really play in some of these very close districts. Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on that. I think first and foremost, and I think this intersects very well with the kinds of topics you talk about and cover on a regular basis, but I guess I'll start with the first thought, which is like voting blocks are not really voting blocks, right? Even within the AAPI community, the number of different cuts of those groups is pretty immense, right? There's not only ethnic cuts of it, there's also generational cuts of it, there's socioeconomic cuts of it, right? And all those different pockets have different points of view as to how they view policies, messaging, what they're exposed to, how they consume information, et cetera, right? And so, I think to your point, like if you just expect them to show up on election day to vote a certain way, that's likely not going to happen. And quite honestly, over the last several years, in large part, I think because of digital, less and less of that is happening, right? The number of people that I've spoken to, for example, within the Korean American community, and I'm Korean, like where their parents are voting Trump and they are voting Democrat, is in part because of the way that they're being engaged and the platforms in which they're consuming news, right? And so, I think those are really good examples of where if we just expect them to vote one way because they voted a certain way without having ever reached out to them or cultivated those relationships, we're not going to be able to turn that tide, right? And the thing is, I think that's actually very much applicable to other quote unquote blocks as well, whether that's the Latino or Hispanic block, whether that is the Black African American block, right? Like all of those different groups have a lot of other sort of segments within them that I don't think we as a party have done a great job of really trying to like tailor and micro message, which actually digital is very well suited for, right? And so, I think that's a good example where being able to engage with the voter over the course of the year, digital is the cheapest way, right? You're not sending direct mail, every month, hoping that someone is going to be home in any given month to be able to see the message that you're talking about. No, by the way, younger voters are not really looking at mail. They go to their mailbox maybe once a week kind of deal, right? Or even if you think about TV and TV news, like likely older voters are consuming TV news. And not only that, they're likely consuming TV news in their native language, right? In which case, what kind of messaging are we doing there? And so I think digital is a part of it. I think it's a very important part of it. And I actually think if we're talking about wanting to get younger voters who are non-white, digital is one of the most important channels we have to do that. But we can't just assume that the last couple of weeks will be sufficient. I think we've seen data where the younger voters are very, very savvy when it comes to digital, right? And so they know a gimmick when they see one. It looks like a gimmick, acts like a gimmick, right? Then they're gonna be like, these people are just here. They want my information so they can bother me for the last 2 weeks with 5 million text messages, right? And so, I think we need to sort of shift as a group our approach and our thinking to that. And, I have a commercial private sector background. Like I think of it as like cultivating a loyalty program, right? It's the same analogy of if I want a customer to be a VIP or a very active voter, I can't just say, hey, come spend with me leading up to a holiday period. I need to have built a relationship with you, and there needs to be trust there where you know that I'm going to give you the best deals 365 no matter what, right? And I think some of that thinking and that infrastructure, and quite honestly, the dollars needed to support that are missing right now, but is one of the key ways that we can sort of, I think, shift back some of those trends, that voting patterns and trends that we have seen, that I think all of us are very concerned about.
A little bit to that. I mean, contemporary political campaign operations are pretty stale still and resistant to change. I mean, that was one of my biggest frustrations, and to a certain extent, that's kind of what led to my retirement. What are your thoughts on the adaptability and innovation in the campaign space when it comes to the business of politics, which means people make commission off of TV buys. They've built their business off of, say, mail program, versus the craft of politics, which means being nimble, taking a bespoke approach to each campaign, those types of things. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a really keen assessment of it. I think at the end of the day, politics are still very human, right? And people know what they know. They're comfortable with what they're comfortable with. I think historically, they've seen the benefits of digital, let's say, but they don't know how to necessarily do that effectively. It seems at times that there's some resistance to that. And then when push comes to shove and you're in the midst of like limited dollars, limited time, you end up reverting to your instincts, which is what you already know how to do. I think the big thing that's actually changing that is AI. Funny enough, I think all of us have heard a lot about it, but it's one of those things where it's moving at a pace that is so fast and so quick, it is impossible to ignore. I was having a conversation with someone recently, and they'd asked the question of like, how concerned should we be about deep fakes? And they're in politics, and the person who was speaking was like, now, yesterday, right? And that freaked them out, and rightfully so. And there's a lot of benefits to AI, to be clear, as well, right? And I think it's a little bit of, whether we like it or not, technology and data and marketing is moving at a pace that's a lot faster than maybe some of these campaigns are ready to take on. But I think we've now hit this sort of like turning point where we will clearly be left behind, even more than maybe we already have in certain instances, if we do not figure out how to adapt, and how to adapt quickly. And I think ultimately what that means is you need to bring in talent that's attuned to that, right? You need to be willing to look at and think about things a different way. You need to be willing to sort of take risks and make some bets, and you can do it in controlled, smart ways, right, to shift the tides. And I think that there's a handful of people that are willing to do that now, when there's a little bit less visibility, so to speak, before the lights are on for 2024. But I think that's also something that we think about a lot within TFC too, where our responsibility is not just to do digital, quote unquote, right, but to help be like true partners to these candidates and campaigns, to like help educate them, help bring them along, decrease their anxiety, as well as the general fear there is, or hesitancy around digital. It's the very traditional argument of like logos, ethos, pathos. Like for any given person, like, do I appeal to your moral side, to your logic with data, emotion? Like, what is it that I can appeal to make it clear? Because we're such firm believers that this is where it's heading, that if we don't act, we're going to be in real trouble next year and beyond, quite honestly, because some of the easier, quote unquote, wins have been made. So now we got to do sort of the next 6-12 years of investment on the state side. And how are we going to go about doing that is really, a lot of it's through digital.
No matter how much technology changes, ultimately it comes down to human behavior and behavioral exploits that can be utilized in order to either benefit us or take advantage of us. But I also think, and I can't say this for the Republican side, but definitely for the Democratic side, I do feel like it requires a mindset change, in the sense that the Democratic mindset is still seasonal. Campaigns come at a certain season. Then we like look at the field and see what's out there, and then we try to adjust to it, as opposed to having 365 days a year for eternity, trying to be ahead of the curve as things are changing. I deal with candidates mostly, and some of their consultants who still live in the 2008 era. They're citing stuff, and it's like, yeah, I have a great deal of fondness for 2008 and even in the 1990s, but the things are changing per cycle. One of the practices that I instituted when I was the political director for the Assembly Democrats is that every campaign cycle, we tore everything down to the studs and we started from scratch every cycle because
Mm,
we couldn't guarantee that the victories that we won in the previous
mm,
cycle were going to carry over to the next one. If they
mm,
did, great. If they didn't,
mm.
then we'll just leave them, on the cutting room floor. But it gave us an opportunity to really come into a cycle prepared for the changes as opposed to trying to force a cycle to behave like the previous cycle.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. And I think that's a huge part. I think that's in large part how we approach it today. And one of the big things that we want to change on the digital side, or at least figure out a way that it can be done cost effectively. And I think things like we were talking about earlier, right? The voter engagement piece of it is like a good example of how you can still keep some version of the lights on so that it's not a complete, build up, tear down every time, which ultimately just makes it more effective and efficient. So
I think ultimately, and as even as tech changes, the problem is that for at least the democratic infrastructure is creating an ecosystem where it's sustainable for the talent that's there. It's like everything is built on seasonal work.
yeah.
Unless we build in something where there's some reasonable stability in
Mm-hmm.
employment
Mm-hmm.
and the ability to learn your craft and
Yeah.
master your craft while on the off season.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, the 12 to 18 months that you're off from a
Yeah.
campaign are
Yeah.
devastating.
Yeah, no, I think we've definitely seen versions of that. And so how to develop talent and make it so that the talent wants to stick around and is being invested in is hugely important, hugely valuable. And I think on the digital side, for a minute, like doing that kind of talent development, it has to be year round because things are changing so quickly. You have to be able to get your hands dirty and try things out. Otherwise, if you pick it back up to 12 to 18 months, it's going to be unrecognizable because it'll be very different.
Yeah, it's kind of like not having a run for a year and then going to a marathon and expecting that you're going to run a good time or even survive it.
Exactly.
And I mean, are there like training programs or like are there academies where we develop tech talent from specifically for the political space, or is it just we're just learn as you burn?
I think there's a couple pieces to that. I think one is we always look to provide training for our volunteers as well as for our candidates when it comes to all things digital so that everyone's starting from as much of a head start as possible. And I think that's really important, again, in the course of like knowing how to use and leverage these tools the most effectively. But I think the second piece is like the tools that we use within digital, they're generally built for commercial use. They're built for the private sector. So you tend to have to get very creative on figuring out how to take a template that's built for something else to apply it to politics, right? And so I think for us, one of the big things that we're looking at is not only looking at what are other people within digital and politics doing, but what are people in digital, broadly speaking, doing, right? What can we bring in? What's interesting? What's relevant? How can we take a lesson or a tactic that's being used in the private sector and say what is actually applicable in a political context? And I think for us, that's in large part, we are benefiting from the fact that our volunteers are coming from that sector. So they're actually a very great resource for us to think about what can we do differently or what can we think about differently in that context. And then I think in terms of, other kinds of training, et cetera, there is no replacement or substitute for just doing it. Right. And again, like I think the beauty of digital is, when you do a TV buy, you've spent tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars making a TV ad, and then another tens of thousands, hundreds of dollars doing the buy. Facebook, you can spend like $100 in a week and you're going to still learn a lot on how to do things effectively. And that's very high ROI in terms of hands-on training, I think, right? I think that's always the advice that I give to anyone who's looking to get into digital, where it's like, just start and there's no shortage of resources. But after that, it's really a game of getting creative and staying on top of all the latest and greatest things that are happening within the space.
Yeah, are there any latest and greatest things that you're super excited about happening in this space?
Yeah. A lot of them will probably have an AI bent to them, I won't lie, because that's a huge part of what we're focused on right now. But there's some really interesting, I think, technologies and platforms out there. I also think Meta and OpenAI, right, with ChatGPT, like those are the most interesting things that are happening. So if you think about how can we use ChatGPT in the context of just generating ideas, right? Or if we're thinking about how can I reframe an ad based on data that I have and applying some of those types of generative AI tools to get a different set of ideas that I can tweak. And then I think within sort of just being able to provide better infrastructure to candidates that is easier to use. That's something we're always evaluating. And there's, things that come up pretty frequently that we are always trying to test out and see what can be the most applicable.
Very cool. In the past, there weren't many AAPIs in American politics. There are many more now, and it's exciting to see, particularly for somebody as old as I am. Uh, what was your experience as an AAPI in this space, and what would you like to see going forward?
Yeah. To be honest, I still think we should have more AAPI in politics. I think we should just have more diversity, particularly in democratic politics, to be honest. I think the voices and viewpoints that we bring are pretty diverse and unique. And there's a difference between knowing and having lived an experience, right? And so I think being able to bring that perspective is one that I think a lot of people definitely respect, but I just think we need more of. Just I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee, or I went to high school in Memphis, Tennessee, and it's obviously a very different environment than where I live now in California, which is very different than Philadelphia or DC or Boston or some of the other places I've lived. And, I think there's always this aspect of being able to see yourself in the roles that you might not even know that you want. And I wonder, like, if I had seen more prominent AAPI members in politics when I was younger, would this have been a path that I forged earlier for myself, or would it have been something that I've chosen to do differently for myself? I also think there's some within the AAPI community, I think there's also some challenges as it relates to the divide between parties that also need to be pretty seriously worked through, because I think it's creating an environment where there's a lot of disunity that's happening. I live in Southern California, so to witness what happened between Michelle Steele and Jay Chen, for example, was pretty horrifying. We have a lot of work to do as a community of AAPI. There's no reason for us to be tearing each other down as part of that, just so that we can say we won, even if we disagree on our beliefs, right? Like, in terms of what I'd like to see going forward, I think it's not only more AAPI getting involved, and I think a huge part of that is also around making clear that our voices and our points of view are valued and really integrated in a thoughtful way. It's also about the fact that we are a diverse group of voters. There are Republican AAPI members just as much as there are Democratic AAPI voters, right? And so being viewed as such with that complexity, but not necessarily letting that overtake how we treat each other, I think is really probably the other thing that I wonder about. I think Orange County in general is a really good example of that. And being able to cross those divides as a group just, I think, makes us stronger, because otherwise we get exploited, right? You look at places like Florida, where Governor DeSantis signs a bill saying it's okay to have AAPI History Month, and some people are applauding that. I'm like, no, that's not that exciting. African American history is being wiped out of Florida. We're being used and exploited. And there are groups of AAPI that are letting that happen. Affirmative action case in front of the Supreme Court is no different, right? And my viewpoint on that might be controversial, but I think for me, like, being able to see it from that lens, I think really sort of reinforces my point of view that we stand alone, but we also stand together. And so for us to be able to have a perspective in terms of operating from a place of wanting to do better for the community as a whole is really, really important. And I think we just need more of that. And it's not just within AAPI by any means, but I think we can really try and be leaders in that. And I think that would be really great to see.
Yeah, I think that's the point, is that the challenge of leadership in our communities, because it is a lot of complexity and it's nuance. And I think that the first step is who wields the knife. Like, if we're in a fight with each other, how I'm going to approach fighting against another AAPI is going to be different. When I was political director, we were running against an Asian American Republican in one assembly seat. And the consultants produced some offensive mail that I had to stop. And it meant we might lose the race, but we're going to lose the race if that's the case. But if I wasn't in that seat at the time to say, yeah, the seat is not important enough for us to be able to use something like this for the long game and for who we are as a party, I'm going to object to that. Without being at the table, that conversation is very hard. I've seen
Yeah.
Democratic consultants make, horrible decisions. I mean, seen Republican consultants making horrible decisions. Horrible decisions are nonpartisan. But, what I've always advocated is that we really do need to have a seat at the table. And then when we do have people at the table, they need to be well trained. They need to know what they're doing, and they need to have gotten to the table not as a token or not as somebody's appointee, but somebody who belongs at that table. Because I write about being power adjacent. And then we've got a lot of people who are involved in politics who got there through appointments or through friendships or relationships they developed. And it's seen more as a feather in the cap than a craft or
Mm,
their profession. So
mhm,
when they get to these tables, they're more concerned about keeping their status than
mhm,
they are about doing what's right. And
mm.
that's what makes
Yeah.
it difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. No, 1,000%. I mean, I think that's also, not to necessarily extrapolate to the full community by means, but I do think there's a different point of view within a also like a first or second generation immigrant narrative about how we think about all of that too, that I think is like hugely tied up into the psychology of how we approach the viewpoint of community in the context of politics. And so I think the power piece and the status piece is definitely all entangled within that. And, I think there's also a perspective of like, well, what can politics do for me? I have engaged, I am a tax paying citizen. I do what I'm supposed to do, but what has government really done for me? And I think there's a degree of that cynicism that I think the younger generations definitely have less of because they've all just grown up here and it's baked into their expectation. But I think there's some of that aspect too when I think about what can we do about representing our viewpoints fairly and accurately that will also resonate with the largest group of people. And so I think there's different threads tied up in that, but that's definitely an area that we think about as well, or that I think about as well.
Ultimately, it'll come down to plenitude and delivery, because I think that just being in the space to compete and to add context to a conversation is important. And I think that that's, for example, when we talk about affirmative action, we're really not talking about affirmative action. What the people who are opposed to affirmative action are just talking about access to elite schools, not academic fairness or academic merit. It's about access to elite schools and the status that that conveys. And that's what they're fighting for. They're fighting for the status of having as many spots at Harvard or having as many spots in Berkeley or wherever as they possibly can, outside of the context of what is the greater good and what is the mission of a university, a public university
Yeah.
overall. So once, if we're forced into the conversation about that as opposed to outside of the context of what the mission of
Mhm.
public education is, then, obviously that's a losing argument.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Well, cool. We're at time. Any last words of encouragement for the Ronin Nation before we sign off this week?
I mean, I think for me, there's a couple of thoughts I'd love to, I guess, share. One is persistence. There's a lot of people that will tell you no, or that you shouldn't and you couldn't. But I would love to think that that's really just motivation and fodder for us to keep fighting and keep resisting and keep building towards what we know is right. So that's one. And I think the second is gratitude. I think having a community that is engaged, passionate, and really looking to build the kind of community that the Ronin Nation is building is one that's pretty special. And so I'm really grateful to be part of it now and excited to see how it will grow and evolve in the future.
Awesome. Well, it's so great to have you on. Great insights. And I wish you all the best of luck for the 2024 cycle that's coming up.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, that's it for this week, Ronin Nation. We'll see you next time. If you are inspired by the exploits of the amazing Asian American badasses on the Ronin Project podcast and want to find out how you can learn more about politics or help Asian American candidates, click on the link in the show notes to join the Ronin Nation's national progressive movement to inspire, organize, and empower Asian Americans. Until next time, Ronins, roll program.